Welcome to this week's Bible in the News. As has been explained on previous editions of Bible in the News, we expect that at the time of Christ's return, Britain will not only be separate from the EU, but also diplomatically opposing its actions, accusing it of invading the land of Israel with the motive of monetary gain. In Ezekiel 38 verse 13 we read that Tarshish, which is Britain, asks the invading nations, which includes the EU, "Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil?" So we can see that Britain is diplomatically opposing what is being done by these nations, and making accusations that only an opponent might make, that those nations were starting what would be a world war purely for money. For nearly 50 years Britain has been a member of the EU, and has been very tightly entangled with its policies, economic structures, and also security. Since joining the EU, politicians in the UK have been largely pro-EU. Indeed, MPs voted to remain in the EU by a margin of 3-1, but the country voted to leave. Because of this, after the EU referendum result, the prevailing opinion among the MPs was to keep Britain as close to the EU as possible, while fulfilling the referendum result. On Prime Minister Theresa May's first visit to the European Council back in 2016, she made clear that she wanted to, quote, cement Britain as a close partner of the EU, and stressed that she wanted Britain and the EU to continue to be close friends and allies together. She then went further in her speech in Florence to the EU.
There is a vibrant debate going on about the shape of the EU's institutions and the direction of the Union in the years ahead. We don't want to stand in the way of that. Indeed, we want to be your strongest friend and partner as the EU and the UK thrive side by side.
So Theresa May was clear that she wanted Britain to be a supporter of the actions of the EU in future, particularly the idea of an EU army. She didn't want Britain to be standing in the way of the EU. But of course, this will be its future role, to stand up against the EU at the time of Christ's return, and not to be side by side as she wanted.
But what we do want, and what we hope that you, our European friends, want too, is to stay as partners who carry on working together for our mutual benefit. In short, we want to work hand in hand with the European Union rather than as part of the European Union. That is why in my speech at Lancaster House I said that the United Kingdom would seek to secure a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union.
And so again we see that Theresa May had this desire to work hand in hand with the EU, to remain partners, to remain close friends, to remain allies with the European Union. This was her vision for the future relationship between the UK and the EU. Theresa May was so wedded to her vision of this close friendship between the EU and UK that she attempted 3 times and even offered to give up her own job to persuade MPs to accept it, despite it being defeated by record-breaking margins. Theresa May was then forced to humiliate herself further by extending the leaving date not once but twice in order to get this close relationship through Parliament, but all to no avail. MPs who want Britain to remain in the EU or to have a closer relationship with the EU have forced votes on a range of all possible forms of Brexit that would leave Britain and the EU on good terms, each time being rejected, and each door they try to attempt being slammed shut in their face, now leaving them with few options except no deal and to revoke Article 50 and remain in the EU. With Theresa May now leaving office, the leadership election process is now well underway. To many candidates, to leave without a deal would be a disaster, but to remain is unthinkable. Despite the EU consistently ruling out any changes to Theresa May's deal, many of the candidates are still determined to have a close friendship with the EU after Brexit, and are therefore determined to come up with some kind of deal when they leave the EU. But as we have seen, at the time of Christ's return, the UK and the EU will not have a close friendship, nor will they be allies. They will be opposing each other diplomatically. And how we get to that situation, we of course do not know. But it may be that what we are seeing here at the moment is the UK being forced to leave on bad terms, despite all of the will of the politicians in the country, so that it is prepared for the role that it has at the time of the return of Christ. Some candidates, including the seeming frontrunner Boris Johnson, have pledged to not pay the £39 billion exit bill in the event of leaving without a deal, and this has angered the EU so much that the French came out and told Reuters in response that they would consider this a, quote, sovereign debt default, whose consequences are well known. Now, whether EU nations would take up this extreme position, it's impossible to say, but this just begins to show how the EU might react to a no-deal Brexit. A great rift would develop between the UK and the EU. We, of course, do not know if this is how the negative relationship between the UK and the EU will develop, but we do know that it must have come about by the time of the Battle of Armageddon, as we read in Ezekiel 38. And whoever becomes the new leader, the new Prime Minister of the UK, it is likely they will continue to fight every step of the way to leave the EU on good terms, to keep a close relationship, a close friendship, a partnership with the EU. But as we are already seeing, the events are going out of their control, for it is the Most High that rules in the kingdoms of men. Join us again next week for another edition of Bible in the News.